All right, this is part two of your fluid and hydration status lecture. We're a little bit more than halfway done at this point. And let's talk more. So, we've set the stage. We've talked about dehydration. How do we measure it? Why is it? What causes it? What are the symptoms? What's this whole thing about over drinking and hypohydration or hyponatremia? And we also discussed briefly hyperhydration. Let's talk now specifically about the effects of hydration and exercise performance. Because ultimately, in the context of sport, this is a pretty sort of hotly debated and highly researched area. So the question is, is dehydration detrimental to exercise performance? If so, at what point? How dehydrated do we need to be for it to affect performance? If so, during what type, duration, and intensity of exercise does it happen, or when? And then also, if so, how do we prevent it? And of course, as you know in my classes, the answer is it depends. It depends on a lot of things. So let's get to it. If we look at endurance exercise as a form of, as a category of exercise, we do have research that supports the idea that dehydration leads to impaired performance. One of the main mechanisms is through the compromised cardiovascular function. So at about 2%, 3% dehydration, the research is pretty consistent saying, as you lose blood volume, the heart is going to have to contract more frequently to get the same volume of blood out, right? Even though the blood's a little bit more concentrated, which means there's more oxygen in a certain volume of blood, the heart is still beating harder, which means it's closer to its max beating rate for a given exercise intensity, which is not good. And research has also shown that VO2 max is decreased with dehydration. Studies that take individuals and have them exercise till they can't exercise anymore. I know that sounds like a lot of fun, right? Has also showed some interesting results. There's a study done at the AIS, Australian Institute of Sport. It was a cycling study. It took athletes who were 3.5% dehydrated. And what they typically do in these studies is they normally hydrate somebody and then they put them in something like a sauna or some sort of hot, humid environment until they lose a designated predetermined amount of body weight. And they go, yep, now you're so many pounds, you've lost this much fluid. Now we're going to do the research protocol with you. So, and what they did in this research at the AIS was they gave athletes two scenarios. So they came back twice to do the study. During one, they were given 2.4 liters of a 7% carbohydrate drink, which means 7% glucose or some sort of similar simple sugar was mixed into that drink, basically Gatorade. Or they received a gel. And gels are interesting because they're essentially a sports drink just minus the fluid, right? A gel has the same concentration or same amount of calories, same amount of electrolytes. There's just no water, so that's why they can compact them into those little packets. It was 2 hours of exercise, which basically means they gave the athletes 1.2 liters of fluid per hour. If that number sounds familiar, it's working off of that optimum absorption rate for most individuals, so they didn't want to give them too much or too little. So 1.2 liters per hour for 2 hours. They had them cycle at 50% of their VO2 max, so not a very high intensity. That's considered moderate. And there was an 8% grade, which that needs to be removed because this is not on a treadmill. This is on a bike. So what they found was heart rate was higher, 12 beats per minute in the gel group versus the drink group. And time to exhaustion was 13.8% shorter for the gel group versus the drink group. So high dehydration in the group that was only given the gel definitely affected their cycling performance over a 2 hour, basically a 2 hour time trial. The reason that the loss of blood volume is so detrimental, this slide sort of sums it up. It's somewhat redundant to stuff we've covered. Those of you in ex-phys, you know who I'm looking at, should know this quite well. But yeah, blood volume is essential for all cardiovascular functions. So we're talking about the delivery of oxygen to tissues. You all know how important that is for performance. Other nutrients that need to get delivered to other tissues for normal physiological function, removal of waste, and that includes carbon dioxide and other products that dissolve in plasma. Thermoregulation, we do start to get dehydrated potentially without enough fluid or water there to help cool us down. Regulation of blood pressure, and even there's effects on immune system function. So blood volume becomes really critical to performance. This is data from a study done by Armstrong it's quite old, back in 1985. But it's it's data that's used in a lot of different textbooks. And so this research compared athletes exercising while 2% dehydrated at 3 different distances. So they had them do this first distance, which was a 1 mile run. This was a 5 mile run, or sorry, 5K run. And then this is a 10K. So 1.6K, which is basically 1 mile, 5K, and a 10K. And what they measured was their running velocity, so basically performance time, during these efforts. And so the longer the duration of the activity, it's hard to say that it absolutely went up the effects of dehydration, but definitely between the 1 mile and the 5K and 10K, even the 1 mile distance was affected by dehydration by about 3.1%. So the people who were hydrated ran 3.1% faster. During the 5K, they ran 6.7% faster, and during the 10K, 6.3% faster. You can only speculate if you carry that out to a marathon, which is 40K, would that difference increase? Depends, right? We don't know for sure, but at the very least, it illustrates that even at 2% dehydration, we do see performance differences in running. Another set of research done, Costel's in the mix, but it's a different group of researchers other than Costel. Took a group of individuals, had them exercise 3 different times. One time they're given nothing. One time they're giving a saline solution. One scenario they're given water. And you can see as exercise went on over time, right on the x-axis, you have time in hours. Heart rate went up most dramatically for the group that had no fluids, and to the point where they could only exercise for 5 hours versus 6. To me, 5 hours is a pretty good clip. I don't remember what intensity exercise this is, but to exercise 5 hours without anything to drink is a lot. Both the saline and water groups, their heart rate stayed relative. The average heart rate 140 versus 135, 5-beat difference between the two. Both groups were able to exercise for the full 6 hours. The saline group did lead to just a slightly higher heart rate. Could be multiple reasons for that, but the difference between heart rate, those 5 beats, aren't that large. But for clear reasons, these are both lower than the no fluid, right? Maintenance of blood volume means heart rate can stay lower, heart doesn't have to beat as hard. So see some positive effects from consuming fluids during exercise. Research done on mixed sport and motor skill related studies. There's a handful out there, right? There's a study done at Penn State where they dehydrated their subjects 2%. They did an exercise session followed by a high intensity skill drill. So it was a sort of a game situation type of skills. It was done on a group of basketball players. The result is that the 2% dehydration led to impaired shooting and defensive drill time. So what they did, they had everyone do the same endurance sort of workout, and then after the workout, they had them basically run some drills. Shooting and defensive drill times were affected. A group was given the group came back, and so they did a dehydration trial, but then they also did a trial where they were given a carbohydrate drink. The carbohydrate group had improved performance. Kind of a no-brainer, right? But it's for some of you in the class, and in my role at St. Mary's with a lot of my athletes that I talk to, it's like, why are you not drinking more during practice? Why are you not consuming a carbohydrate drink? It improves the way you perform on the court, on the field, on the track. That will lead to long-term benefits and performance for sure. So dehydration and strength, there is little to no effect during short-term strength activities, right? So your ability to do your 500-pound squat or bench press or whatever it is, not that affected, right? It's too reliant on factors that aren't necessarily associated with hydration status. So a study done at University of Connecticut showed that a 5% dehydration, that's a lot of dehydration, increased cortisol release following a 10-minute run at 70% and 85% of VO2 max. That is meaningful, right? So if we're seeing individuals try to train That dehydrated, we're going to see some hormonal responses. Cortisol will lead to greater muscle catabolism and fat storage. So again, short-term stuff, strength won't be affected, but over time, the effects of increased cortisol release will potentially lead to poor adaptations to training. Testosterone and cortisol have a sort of an inverse relationship. So when cortisol is high, testosterone is going to be low, and so that increased cortisol as a result from training while dehydrated may affect testosterone release, which means adaptation to training can be affected as well, which could affect strength. So again, directly strength isn't so affected, but perhaps in the long term, it could be. So the summary of the research, to answer those questions that we set out to answer: at what point does dehydration affect exercise? 2 to 3%, firstly, won't lead to heat-related illnesses. So don't stress about 2 to 3% dehydration. But endurance performance does start to decline at about that level. And so for endurance athletes, the recommendations are do your best to maintain it. Go into endurance events well hydrated and just drink what you can drink during, but don't overhydrate. In terms of motor skills, those are going to be affected at about the same level. Again, we're not talking about heat-related stuff. We're talking straight performance. Same sort of strategy should be involved, right? Just because you're a basketball player or volleyball player, whatever it is, doesn't mean you don't need to drink. You have the same needs as other athletes to maintain hydration. We do see that increased release of cortisol and many other factors actually occurring at about a 5% dehydration, which we should never allow ourselves to get to. So intensity and duration, assuming adequate prehydration practices, an hour of exercise without adequate rehydrating could lead to about a 2% dehydration. So it could take an hour to get to this place where we start to see performance affected. Higher intensity, hotter and humid conditions will increase sweat, and therefore that could happen even sooner, or the longer you go, the more severe it could be. So how are we going to prevent it? Let's talk about sports drinks. So this part of the talk, and this is sort of what we end up finishing with for the most part, is, we need to understand what sports drinks can and can't do for us. What should the ultimate sports drink do? What can it do? What should be in the ultimate sport drink? Should there be water? Of course, there has to be water. But should it include carbohydrates? Should it include electrolytes? Should it include some protein, right? And that's been a topic of, I'd say, more debate recently than the carbohydrate and electrolyte issues. So let's start this conversation on sports drinks, talking about some physiology. And so we're going to look at this old slide, which I could surely find a better one, right? But and this is a slide that highlights the gastric emptying. And gastric emptying is a term used to describe how quickly things leave our stomach, right? So this graphic has the stomach in the middle here. This is our duodenum, right? This is our small intestine. So this is pyloric sphincter right here. Lower esophageal sphincters somewhere up there. And so gastric emptying is a big deal because when we're looking at a sports drink, we don't want it to sit in our stomach for too long. The longer something's in our stomach, the longer it's going to take to get absorbed into our body. Remember, we don't absorb anything in our stomach other than a little bit of alcohol. And you shouldn't be drinking alcohol when you train. So we want things to leave our stomach quickly. And then once they get in the small intestine, we want them to leave that quickly as well. We want to get these fluids and electrolytes and carbohydrates or whatever else into our bloodstream as quickly as possible. So I'm going to go over some of these factors. You can expect to see them again on some sort of multiple guess type of, maybe short answer type of question. You never know. So if we look, and I'm just going to start here. If we look at a fluid in our stomach, we're going to have blue lines associated with fluids that increase gastric emptying or increase absorption in the small intestine. The red lines decrease the rate of emptying or the rate of absorption. And the thicker the line, the more of effect and the more important that effect is. And then those that are in boxes are the most important. So we have a couple that are in boxes, right? So if we start up here with fluid temperature, so low fluid temperature, so cold beverages, actually have a positive effect on gastric emptying. That's kind of counterintuitive to a lot of people, including myself. And for several years, probably in the early 90s, mid 90s maybe, people were starting to say, oh, you should be drinking your sports drink, your Gatorade, whatever it is, warm. like drink it at body temperature. Because if you drink it at body temperature, it doesn't have to get warmed up before it leaves your stomach and goes into your small intestine. So for a while, like warm Gatorade was a thing. That was not a good time. Since then, thankfully, gastric emptying research, which is quite gross, has shown that, yeah, decreased fluid temperature does lead to quicker or better gastric emptying. Gastric emptying research does involve tubes into your stomach and pumping stomach contents after a certain amount of time, right? So don't want to be subject for that. Moving along on a clockwise order, so osmolality. So the higher the osmolality of a substance, the slower the rate of gastric emptying. And so if you consume something with the osmolality of, let's say, 500, right? Remember, 280 to 300 is normal. 500, at that high osmolality, it's going to take a while to leave the stomach. And what the stomach actually likes to try and do is dilute that osmolality down as close to 300 as it can get before it lets you leave the stomach. So we might even lose fluid from other body components of dumping fluid into the stomach to dilute something that has a high osmolality. Those gels are an example. They are such high osmolality. They're in the thousands, right? And so you drop a gel into your stomach and your stomach's like, oh, we need to dilute this. And so, yeah, so that definitely slows gastric emptying. Carbohydrate concentration. So the more carbohydrate in the drink, the slower the gastric emptying. There's a sweet spot, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, but if you have something that's overly concentrated in carbohydrates, it will take a while to leave your stomach, almost in the same sense that osmolality does. It just needs to be diluted a little bit. Fat content, as you'd expect, that'll slow things down. We don't usually put fat in our sports drinks. There's no reason for it. Protein content will also slow things down. And again, these three macronutrients in part play a role in just increasing osmolality. So they're all very much related. So, but we are seeing proteins, at least amino acids, right? Individual amino acids typically show up in sports drinks, and they will sometimes slow gastric emptying if there's too much. The volume of fluid is a big player, and the more fluid you consume, the faster the gastric emptying rate is. So if you try and drink 2 liters of water at once, you'll probably get more of that, a higher volume of fluid out of the stomach than had you only drank half a liter. Kind of makes sense in a way, right? Acidic solutions slow down gastric emptying. So we talk about, drinking orange juice or having oranges at halftime at soccer games. Probably not a good idea. And the higher the fructose content, which, yes, that's the same as carbohydrate concentration, but fructose in and of itself slows gastric emptying down. So the same concentration of a different sugar, let's say dextrose, would actually have a faster gastric emptying than the same volume of or concentration of fructose. All right, so once we get from the stomach into the small intestine, then we kind of see a little bit of a change in the positive factor. So if we can get glucose into the small intestine, that will help with the rate of the absorption through the intestinal walls. Recall that glucose gets transported through active transport. Those transport channels actually help pump water across as well, or they allow more water to get across. So glucose in the small intestine is a positive factor, as is sodium. So if we can get sodium and glucose into the small intestine, that's a good thing. So the trick is, don't put too much glucose to slow gastric emptying, but put enough to maximize absorption in the small intestine. So know a little bit about this slide. It's been up for a few minutes now, but you could always screenshot it or whatever you guys do. So, all right. So getting to sports drinks, what's best, right? And I have this slide of 10 different ones or whatever that is, and there's so many of them out there, right? And some of these probably aren't on the market anymore. There's newer energy drinks now that are not necessarily the best choice with the amount of stimulants that they throw in them. So I'm going to compare, I'd say, 3 sort of extremes. Let's start with water. Water as a sports drink. Firstly, yeah, it's not that effective overall. It doesn't have any carbohydrates in it. It doesn't have any sodium. It has very low osmolality, which means it does get absorbed or it leaves the stomach very quickly. And it actually gets into the blood quite quickly as well. But it doesn't give us energy and it doesn't give us any electrolytes. It will, because of its osmolality of 0, dilute the blood. And as we started this whole lecture off with in the previous half, when we talked about diluting the blood or decreasing osmolality, what's that going to do? That's going to decrease thirst because your blood's getting thin. Your body's like, stop drinking. So decrease thirst. It's going to increase urine output. Ultimately, what it's going to do is lead to less drinking and less fluids getting in your body. So water as a hydration beverage is not optimal during exercise. And this is only during exercise. Throughout the day, water is amazingly awesome. But if you're talking about hydrating during exercise, maybe not the best choice. If we take your standard blue colored drink, right? Things that never happen in nature in terms of color of food, they're all kind of the same. And so sports drinks, they are quite effective. They have a carbohydrate concentration of about 4 to 8%. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But the range of most sports drinks out there is this 4 to 8%. Why? The research has shown that tends to be the optimum range for gastric emptying and therefore ultimately getting into the intestine and getting absorbed into the body. So we're getting a good concentration of carbohydrates into our body, but not too much. They also have a varying range of sodium. And so that 5 to 25 milliequivalents of sodium, that's a positive. We can tolerate more than that, but when we start putting more than 25 milliequivalents of sodium into a drink, it starts to taste quite salty. And so, again, these manufacturers are smart enough to know they want their drinks to taste good. So the effects of consuming sports drinks, well, firstly, they don't dilute the blood. So they don't affect osmolality. And so the goal of most of these sports drinks is to provide a product that they call isotonic. Isotonic means that it has a normal osmolality. So the isotonic drinks, I think Gatorade's right in that zone, have an osmolality of about 280 to 300. That means when we drink them and they get absorbed, blood osmolality doesn't go up or down. It stays where it should be. And that's really important. So because osmolality is maintained, thirst actually stays where it was before. Thirst isn't necessarily quenched. That's a positive effect. We want to be drinking more. So we want to keep drinking. We don't want to overdrink, but because there's sodium and electrolytes in these beverages, we are not at risk of the hyponatremia in the same way. That maintenance of osmolality means urine production will either stay the same or go down, which is good. So we have some positive results from using these sports drinks. Another bonus is that they taste good, right? People like to drink these sweet things. They have all these great flavors, I guess. So yeah, that tends to lead to drinking more if given the opportunity. The third beverage I'll compare is cola or sodas, right? And there's other, kind of fall in line with most energy drinks too, right? So cola does have some caffeine. It's just missing some of the other fancy stimulants that the sports energy drinks have. So not so effective. I'd say it falls in between water and a sports drink in a way. A lot of athletes, a lot of cyclists, at least that I know, will actually take like a cola and just dilute it 50%. And if you dilute it, at least carbohydrate concentration wise, it puts it in a pretty good zone. Straight cola or soda or an energy drink, it has too much carbohydrate, have over 12% carbohydrate solution. And that's just too much. And that will slow gastric emptying. If it's a carbonated drink, carbonation will slow gastric emptying and can cause bloating, which is quite uncomfortable. It's hard to drink a lot of these carbonated beverages and these highly sweetened beverages, especially compared to the sports drinks. And because of typically the caffeine and other stimulants that are in them, it will increase urine output, which can possibly affect hydration status. So really the designated or the designed sports drinks, right? Those drinks that are designed specifically with sports in mind are doing an okay job. And I don't, people ask me, which do I use? I don't, because I'm not like you guys and I don't train, but generally speaking, most of them are kind of on the same level. There's some newer ones that are coming out with pretty much all food-based ingredients. So a lot of, I'm not a big fan of Gatorade. I don't know if they still use, high fructose corn syrup was one of their main ingredients for many years. It's like, really, we could do better than that, right? So there are some more natural versions of these sports drinks coming out with the same parameters, and I think those are great. But what's available to you, what you can afford, what you think is best is best. So the optimum characteristics of a sports drink, 4 to 8% carbohydrate solution. If you're looking at the label of a sports drink, here's how you calculate the percent carbohydrates of that drink. So if you divide the grams of carbohydrate per serving by milliliters per serving. If they don't tell you the milliliters per serving, 1 ounce equals 30 milliliters. So as an example, one serving, in this case 8 ounces, it'll tell you on the label. It has 14 grams of carbohydrates. If we take the 8 ounces, multiply that by 30, that's 240 milliliters in this serving. So we divide the 14 grams of carbohydrates by the 240 milliliters, and that gives us 0.06 or a 6% solution. So that's how we calculate the percent carbohydrates in a drink. If there's protein in the drink, you do the same thing with the protein. You can actually add the protein and the carbs together to get the total grams of carbohydrates and protein. Do the same math and you'll get the percent concentration of carbs and protein. That's basically, you still want it to be in that 4 to 8% range. Sodium up to 100 milliequivalents, which is very salty. Most are in the 20 range. I think Gatorade's in the 10 range, 10 or 11. Osmolality, we want it to be isotonic. So we want it to be in that 250, 300 millosmolar zone. It can be a little hypotonic, which is below 280, as you see in that example. That's still okay. Most sports drinks are designed to be in that range. But if you're mixing them yourself, right, and you have the powder, if you put an extra scoop of powder in it, it's going to double the osmolality. So be mindful of that. Volume, not too much, but it needs to taste good. So in terms of volume, obviously we don't want to overdo it or underdo it, but if it tastes good, we're typically more likely to replace more of what we lose. Temperature should be cold. Carbonation shouldn't be carbonated. Should there be stimulants in it? My general rule of thumb is not in your sports drink. If you want to do caffeine, get it in a different form. But when it's dedicated to your sports drink, you don't always, it ends up being too much caffeine for some people. So you can add caffeine in other creative ways. A look at some different sports drinks that are available on the market. Not all of them are out there that I know of still, but Power Bar Endurance, Gatorade Endurance, Accelerate, Cytomax, Powerade, Goo 20, Cliff Shot, all these companies, again, most of these companies are still out there. Grams of carbohydrates per 8 ounce serving. Concentration percent, right? And so Power Bar Endurance is on the high end compared to most others. You got your Gatorade right there at 6. Sodium in milligrams. I didn't do the milliequivalents. Again, Gatorade, I think, is right around that 10 to 12 milliequivalent zone, but this is the endurance formula. So this one might be a little bit different than regular Gatorade. So yeah, we have a range. Calories, yeah, not so important. The source of sugar does make a bit of a difference. We touched on this during our carbohydrate talk. We have a mix of types of sugars. They're all basically simple sugars. Some of them are a little slower. Fructose slows things down. You know that fructose needs to get converted to glucose in the liver, so that's a little bit more of a time release carbohydrate. Maltodextrin, so dextrose in general, is very quick to absorb. Cliff Shot electrolyte down here, brown rice syrup, and cane juice. So it's trying to use some more food-based products, but basically all these are straight up sugar. Various beverages. So these aren't just sports drinks. If we look at the carbohydrates, this is per 8 ounces. Cola has 39. Where on the previous slide we had per 8 ounces. 14 is in Gatorade Endurance. So this is, more than double a Gatorade in terms of carbohydrates. Ginger ale, beer, not necessarily to be used for sports drink. Gatorade, there it is. I was going to say this is 12 ounces, not 8 ounces. So, a little different volume serving size. So anyway, different carbohydrate amounts, different sodium amounts. Cola does have very little bit of sodium, but nothing compared to a dedicated sports drink. So optimum hydration strategy. So how do we optimize it? You drink, right? And so we drink water throughout the day. That's just what we do. Oops, sorry. Water throughout the day to maintain normal hydration. When it comes to volume, I like the 1 milliliter per calorie expended plus sweat. And it's hard to calculate sweat, but if you weigh yourself, sometimes you can get an idea, or you just drink extra because you're thirsty, right? And listening to your thirst is one of my main strategies. Don't overdo it. Don't force yourself to drink if you're not thirsty. Drink water throughout the day. When it comes to training, I'm a fan of the sports drinks to help with training performance and ultimately competition performance. So I think it's a good idea for some athletes. not all, but some athletes to do a pre and post weight assessment. Be mindful that you need to do it dry. Like some athletes will, weigh themselves, and then after practice they weigh themselves, and all of a sudden the clothes that they're weighing is weighing an extra 10 pounds because the sweat is all in their clothes. So it is best to weigh yourself without clothes on, or at least dried off with dry clothes before and after, and that gives you a better idea of how much fluid you lost. You don't need to match your weight loss with drinking while you exercise or even afterwards, but listen to your thirst, right? So for longer activities, an hour plus, definitely consider the carbohydrates, not just for the energy, but also for the increased effect on hydration. So the sports drinks with carbohydrates and electrolytes. Do not ever force yourself to drink extra water. So, yeah, so I got ahead of myself. Anything new or unique here? No. Water throughout the day. Sports drinks are fine. Yeah, so timing wise, if you start to do sports drinks, depending on the event, like for daily practices, I don't push 16 ounces of a sports drink 2 hours prior. If you have a big event coming up and you're concerned, like, hey, I need to, like, not carbo load necessarily, but I need to get some more carbohydrates in my body, I would start drinking that 16 ounces 2 hours prior and keep drinking until the time of the event. Maybe add, 16 ounces, over that starting 2 hours prior, and then within 20 minutes start drinking another 8 ounces just to top off blood sugar levels, but also to make sure you're adequately hydrated. Volume is super individualized. Everyone has a different tolerance. Some people can only have a couple sips and they get a side ache. Some people can drink as much as they want and they don't get side aches, right? Or gastric upset or just uncomfortableness, right? So it really depends on you as an individual and what you're doing. And experiment during practices, not during a competition, of course. But that's something that people have to learn, what their limits are. During exercise, the goal should just be to minimize losses. Like, don't try and match losses. That's just ends up being a very frustrating experiment. So do what you can. You can probably absorb somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.2 liters of fluid an hour. So think about that, right? Depending on how many hours you're going or what kind of access to drinks you have, you may want to take a big drink during halftime of a soccer match or basketball match if you don't get that many breaks. But if you get a lot of breaks, just a little bit throughout, sometimes it's a better strategy than one big volume at once. Again, very, very individualized sort of process. Post-exercise, the goal is to recover lost fluids and electrolytes so you can get back at it again and be normally hydrated. The optimum rehydration strategy doesn't look that much different than other strategies we've been talking about. So the carbohydrates should be included in your rehydration strategy. This is sort of doubling up on purpose, right? We've talked about recovery from sport. Yeah, we should always drink a protein carbohydrate drink. Well, we're still in that range. So 10% carbohydrate solution is good. It doesn't have to be sort of isotonic in this case, right? We're not overly concerned about that now because we're not exercising anymore. So it can be up to 10% carbohydrates. That will help with absorption. That'll help with recovery. Usually, the sweeter drinks actually taste good. If it gets too much above 10%, gastric upset might happen. So, don't go crazy on the carbohydrates necessarily. It can also have quite a bit of sodium in it. The 100 mil equivalents, like I said, that's a lot of salt and doesn't taste very good. I know athletes who salt their Gatorade just for post-exercise to really get the fluids in there immediately. And then they don't do that after that. But then throughout the day, they just drink water and they sort of flush the body after that. Totally works. Volume, just listen to your thirst. You don't have to match. If you lost 4 pounds of weight during a session, don't put 4 pounds of water in front of you and think you have to drink it immediately. Be diligent, drink, but listen to your thirst, and your body will tell you when you need to drink. So that's it. Hope you enjoyed the 2 online lectures, and I will see you soon.